If you're a boxing fan, you'll know that the word overrated gets passed around all the time on social media. When a high-profile fighter has a bad performance or even loses, the word overrated is very quickly put on that fighter. Other words like hype job and exposed are also passed around, but one word that doesn't seem to be used enough is the word underrated. There are so many great fighters in boxing that I don't think it's fair to just focus on the big name fighters. So today we're going through 5 of my personal favourite most underrated fighters in boxing. Just to clarify, to qualify on this list, a boxer has to be at least a top 10 level fighter in that division, meaning that a prospect such as Moses Itama or Bakadeh Jalilov will not count. To go through a few honourable mentions, Sandor Martin and Jermaine Ortiz, both in my opinion, should have wins over Teofimo Lopez. Jesus Ramos got robbed by Erickson Lubin and still is a really good contender at 154. Ajit Kabayel has secretly been a top 5 heavyweight for years, and Anthony Olasquaga is one of the most talented and rapidly improving fighters in the lower divisions. So with all that being said, let's get on with the list. Our number 5 spot is going to go to Brian Norman Jr. Brian Norman Jr. has sort of come out of nowhere in terms of being a world level fighter. He's always been a talented boxer, but it's only until recently that he's even shown signs of being elite level. In terms of his natural attributes, he's good defensively, he's got fast hands, he's got great reflexes. He turned professional at 18 and he kept himself extremely active, fighting as much as 10 times a year. But for whatever reason, his momentum slowed down. After a competitive points decision over Jesus Campos, in November of last year he fought Quinton Randall, which compared to the hype he was given going into the fight, it was a very sloppy and uninspiring performance. There was a lot of clinching and Norman seems to struggle to land anything significant on Randall. But regardless, people dismissed it as an experience as he was only 23 at the time of the fight and expected more next time out. His next fight would be go on. Norman was then booked to fight against fellow undefeated prospect Giovanni Santillan. Santillan was coming off a career best performance in the form of a 5-round destruction of Alexis Rocha. So people were concerned about Norman Jr. in this fight, not just because of his recent form, but his inexperience. This was such a massive step up and a different calibre of fighter and intensity that someone like Santillan brings. So most people, including myself, thought Norman Jr. took a step too far. But the result was incredibly surprising to me. Norman Jr. went on to display an incredible amount of defensive awareness on the back foot that we've never seen from him before in his career. Not only was he avoiding punches expertly, he was also dealing damage himself, eventually rocking Santillan really badly in round 8, which would start the beginning of the end for the 32-0 prospect Giovanni Santillan. Round by round, Norman grew in confidence, and as he grew in confidence, the more damage he started to deal. He broke Santillan's nose in round 9, leaving his face a bloody mess, and he continued to land uppercuts and straight shots until round 10, where he dropped Santillan with an uppercut, and eventually put Santillan down for good with a right hook, left uppercut. This fight was fought for the WBO Interim Welterweight Championship. The main WBO belt would be vacated by Terence Crawford in his move up to 154 pounds, meaning that Brian Norman Jr. was now the World Welterweight Champion. Because of how suddenly Norman seemed to improve in his first world title fight, I think all he can do now is improve even more, and we can expect great things from Norman in the future. Our number 4 spot is going to go to Francisco Rodriguez Jr. For someone who's only 32 years old, Francisco Rodriguez Jr. has fought so many good opponents for such a long time, and has been at the top of the division for such a long time, that I'm surprised he doesn't get brought up more in boxing discussions. This fight on screen is from 2013, in Rodriguez's first world title fight against Roman Gonzalez, also known as Chocolatito. Unfortunately, the fight itself was recorded on a potato, so you can't really see it properly. To summarise it, the undefeated knockout machine, 35-0 champion Chocolatito was simply too much for a 22-year-old Francisco Rodriguez, as Chocolatito would stop him in round 7. After a few wins, Rodriguez would bounce back to face the 23-0 undefeated minimum weight champion Melito Sabio, who he would stop in round 10. So Rodriguez became champion not long after losing his first world title attempt. Rodriguez would then attempt to unify the world titles against IBF champion Katsunari Takayama. It was one of the best fights of the year. It was competitive action, but overall, Rodriguez did enough to become the unified minimum weight champion. He would then move up to light flyweight to face the reigning champion in Filipino Don Nietes. But Nietes, being one of the best flyweights of the 21st century, would outbox Rodriguez Jr. over 12 rounds. It was reasonably competitive, but Nietes would get the decision. And that would inspire Rodriguez to go on a streak of 5 years without a loss, which is rare at flyweight. That win streak included wins over 2 undefeated opponents, including Elias Joaquino and David Barreto, both of which would be knocked out by Rodriguez. Rodriguez's next title fight would be against a more familiar face, Kazuto Ioka, a 4-division world champion and pound for pound one of the best fighters in the lower divisions. Rodriguez wasn't expected to win this one, especially considering the fight was in Japan, but surprisingly Rodriguez seemed to outwork Ioka, but the fight being in Japan, they gave it to the champion, which most people disagreed with. Rodriguez being no stranger to taking risks, he went back to Japan to face the best upcoming Japanese fighter since Naoya Inoue versus Junto Nakatani. Nakatani, leading up to the fight, had either schooled or knocked out almost every opponent he'd faced at that point. But Rodriguez, with his natural toughness and grit, made it a competitive fight, which despite the loss for Rodriguez is still impressive when Junto Nakatani has been since that fight, as he's gone on to become a top 10 pound for pound level fighter. As for Francisco Rodriguez himself since that fight, he's won 3 more fights in a row, including 2 knockouts. His most recent being August of 2024, where he knocked out Jorge Villalobos in round 1. And I believe he's still got the capability to win a world title, only being 32 years old. Our number 3 spot goes to Ryosuke Nishida. Nishida is one of the 4 new wave bantamweight Japanese champions, the other 3 being Junto Nakatani, Sei Tsutsumi and Yoshiki Take. I believe Nishida is the second best of the 4, just behind Junto Nakatani, who's a pound for pound level fighter. Nishida would waste no time at all in his career, because in his 3rd fight, he'd take on an opponent with a record of 21 wins and 3 losses. His 4th opponent would be Daigo Higa, who's also known as one of the hardest punchers in the division. Nishida would outbox Higa for 10 straight rounds convincingly, which becomes more impressive when you consider that Daigo Higa went on to fight Yoshiki Take, the fellow champion in that division, and it was a very, very close fight. Nishida moved up to 8 wins and no losses before being given a title shot versus Emmanuel Rodriguez. Rodriguez, for a bit of context, is also a contender for being on this list. He's a very experienced fighter, a very skilled boxer, and someone with a really good resume at 118 pounds. And this was a fight where I thought going into it, Rodriguez was a step too far for the inexperienced Nishida. But Nishida would drop Rodriguez in round 4 and go on to win a hard-fought, intense, competitive and high-paced decision. This sort of fight is all you really need to know whether a boxer's legitimate or not, as it was a convincing win over a convincing opponent. Rodriguez being someone I considered the best in that division before Junto moved up. Nishida has a fight booked in a couple of weeks against Thai fighter Anuchai Donsua, and I think it's an easy win for Nishida. We move on to our number 2 spot, which is Eduardo Sugar Nunez. Nunez does actually have a loss on his record against Hiram Gallardo. Nunez was deducted a point for a low blow, but overall in terms of the rounds, Nunez was the aggressor in every single round. He was throwing the hard shots in every single round, and he outlanded Gallardo in every single round, according to the stats. So with all that in mind, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for all 3 judges to give the fight to Gallardo, but they did. And all Nunez can do from there is move on and accept it. And from that point onwards, the result of every Nunez fight speaks for itself.
You can really hear the punches.
Eduardo Nunez went on a tear. Before the Gallardo fight, he'd knocked out every single opponent in his path. After the Gallardo fight, he'd do the same. As of right now, he has a record of 27 wins and 27 knockouts. His most impressive win came earlier this year in February against Shavkat Zonrakimov. Rakimov was known for his durability, and he'd just been 12 rounds in a close split decision to the current IBF world champion at the time, Joe Cordina. So this was a considerable step up for Nunez, and it's one that he came through. The fight was somewhat competitive early on, but most of the fight was spent against the ropes, as Nunez landed massive bombs for the entire fight to the body and the head, until the ref eventually had to step in, as Rakimov couldn't take any more in round 11. Nunez, being the first to stop Rakimov, immediately put him in the mix to be a top fighter at 130. His main issue in the past has been his defence, but judging from his fight versus Miguel Mariaga, he seems to have been working on his defence, which is a scary thought for his opponents in the future. Nunez is next in line for a title shot, and I can see him winning against every single champion in that division. And that takes us to our number 1 spot, the most underrated fighter in boxing, Rafael Espinoza. Espinoza, like a few other fighters on this list, has come out of nowhere. To me, Espinoza is a special kind of fighter. There's plenty of tall fighters in boxing, but they seem to come in one of 2 ways. One is a tall fighter who can't really use his range and chooses to stay in the pocket. An obvious example being Sebastian Fundora, who got knocked out for being on the inside too much. The opposite to that is Rey Vargas. Rey Vargas is very good on the outside, but he seems a bit useless on the inside. He always seems to stay away from an inside fight. Which brings us to Rafael Espinoza, who can do both. Espinoza being 6'1" for a featherweight, he's extremely good at dictating distance with his long reach and his long jab. The path to victory to beat this kind of fighter usually is to make it an inside fight, but the difficulty there is that Espinoza is also really good himself on the inside. Espinoza spent 10 years as a professional under the radar, until suddenly being given the opportunity to fight for the title against Robeisy Ramirez. For a bit of context, Ramirez was considered by many to be the best fighter in that division at the time, and as such, Ramirez was a 1-in-14 favourite to win the fight. Espinoza started the fight very well, winning the early rounds before being dropped in round 5 by a massive right hook. Espinoza fell again after the knockdown, so people thought this fight was over, but Espinoza simply used it as a wake-up call for being careless, as Espinoza and Ramirez proceeded to go to war for the remainder of the fight. Espinoza would eat several clean shots on the chin, but Espinoza decided this time if he ate a clean shot on the chin, he'd give one back immediately, so he'd never give Ramirez a chance to rest, as he became increasingly more overwhelmed by the pressure of Espinoza. Espinoza knew the judges weren't going to give him any favours, as it was a closely contested fight, with Ramirez scoring a knockdown. So Espinoza tried his absolute best to find a finish in the final round of the fight, and eventually it became too much for Ramirez, who went down to a knee in round 12. The fight went the distance, and that final knockdown proved to be vital, as Espinoza would become the new champion, winning by majority decision. Since that fight, Espinoza has fought once in a title defence versus Sergio Chirino, where Espinoza put on a performance that proved why he was the champion. He made use of his reach and his pressure extremely well in this fight, backing up Chirino, landing body shots and dropping him multiple times across the fight, before completely melting him in round 4. That was his most recent fight, and he's now boxed for a rematch against Robeisy Ramirez this Saturday. And I don't think Espinoza gets the praise that he should do. If you look at the Ring Magazine rankings, Espinoza's ranked number 5, below Luis Alberto Lopez, who's just been knocked out, Rey Vargas, who's defended his title once in a draw to Nick Ball, and Angelo Leo, who's only been at featherweight for a year, who's never defended his title. Either way, that's my list. Leave a comment with your most underrated boxer, like and subscribe. Goodbye.